So this is a slightly unusual situation. We can see that the London control area is lit up blue, and if we hover over the letters, it tells us which bit of London control is on, and all 4 sectors are being covered. So the London control, as we've discussed before, is split into 4 sectors. Let's get a map of that so we can see. So let's type in Vatsim UK sectors, area sectors. Here we are. Scroll on this, click on this link rather, UK airfield, UK airspace, and it shows you a nice little map. So London control is, I think it's not quite how the real world works. In the real world, you have London and Scottish information regions, and that's a non-radar service. You can call into them to get a basic service. On Vatsim, London control is effectively replacing any missing controllers that are inside of these areas. So let's say we were wanting to fly from Bristol. Here we are, Echo Golf Golf Delta, just there. It's within the London West control area. If there's no tower and no approach controller on at Bristol, London control will cover the controlled airspace, so they will act as both the approach controller and the tower controller, and indeed the ground controller as well. So the subject of top-down control, the way that Vatsim sort of covers up any gaps by using the higher controllers. So we've touched on this before in previous videos. So let's bring up the Vatsim web page for Bristol in the UK, and we'll scroll down here to ATC station. So let's just recap. This is the hierarchy. So when you want to start your engine, you'd look to see if Bristol ground is on. If they're not, you'd look to see if the tower is on. If they are, you ask them for permission to start your engine, just as if you were talking to ground. You'd ask tower for permission to taxi, just like you would ask ground. Tower is basically doing tower and ground. You talk to them on the same frequency though, you talk to them on tower frequency. If they're not online, you look to see if either of these approach controllers are. So in the software, in VatSpy, you see it's labelled as Bristol Approach, but actually you can see here that his correct title is Bristol Radar. So if there are none of these below him, you talk to Bristol Radar and you ask him for permission to start your engine and to taxi, and then when you get to the hold for the runway, it'll be Bristol Radar that gives you your permission to enter the runway, take off, gives you your clearance. So you don't need to keep changing frequencies if there's this top-down service being offered to you. If there isn't Bristol Radar, look to see if London West is on. So in this particular example here, there's no control local to Bristol, but there is Bristol West. So what about this London control position? What service do they actually offer us? Well, apart from filling in the gaps when there's no local controller, they can also offer you a service outside of controlled airspace. So here's our chart at Bristol. So we would take off there and depart the zone. Once we get outside of the zone, London Control would ask us what service we want outside, just like an approach or radar controller would do. And we could ask them for a basic service, in which case they simply give us an up-to-date QNH, they give us a squawk, and they keep a note of our details till we move on to something else. So you might be thinking, well, okay, that sounds fair enough, but kind of what's the point to it? Well, it's up to you really. You don't have to talk to a controller when you're outside of controlled airspace. So once you get outside the zone and they ask you if you want a service outside, you could say no service required. And in which case they will tell you to tune into Unicom, they'll tell you to squawk conspicuity, which most of the time will be squawk 7000, and then you just go off and do your own thing. But actually, if you're on Vatsim, I'd have thought the point of you doing that is to try and integrate as much as possible with controllers, so why turn down the service? So I would ask for a basic service, and although I wouldn't actually be talking to the controller and they wouldn't really be tracking our progress, I'd be tuned into them, listening to what's going on and just sort of soaking up the atmosphere. So then what happens if you're flying along under a basic service from one of these London controllers and you want to come into land somewhere? Well, it depends if your airfield is in controlled airspace or not. So let's say initially our first situation is you want to come into Southampton here. That's got controlled airspace around it. As you approach that, you just treat London Control as if they were a more local controller, either tower or radar, Solent radar it's called at Southampton. So you would speak to London Control as you got close, and you would ask them for permission to enter the zone at Southampton for your landing, and you go through exactly the same process as you would do if you were talking to a tower controller. They would give you a VRP to enter by, they'd tell you the local airfield information, and they would tell you to come in till you have the aerodrome in sight. Once you got there, you would report that, and they would give you permission to join the circuit and to land. But what if your aerodrome isn't in controlled airspace? Let's say my local one at Popham, which is sort of up here-ish. Once you get close enough to your little airstrip that you want to talk on Unicom to announce your arrival, you'd simply say to London Control that you wanted to change frequency to Unicom 122.8. When you say request frequency change to Unicom 122.8, that implies that you want them to stop their service and to release you to go and talk to someone else. Once you make that request, they will just say, my service terminates, squawk conspicuity, bye-bye. Once they've said that, you can then tune in to Unicom 122.8 and make your blind call, Popham traffic, inbound from the northwest, estimate airfield in 5 minutes, that kind of thing.